Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. This is Robert Head with Hemp for Victory. Today I'm going to talk to Shane Pennington. He's a legal advisor for Sue Sisley and will tell us all we need to know about hemp research and medical marijuana research and why it's not getting done. All right, Shane, good to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Hemp short, so about 20 minutes. We're going to discuss something very, very important, and that's going to be the topic of marijuana research. Can you clarify why getting research done on marijuana or cannabis is so hard to the FDA?
In a word, it's because of its Schedule I classification. So marijuana, at least a lot of cannabis, lots of parts of the cannabis plant are Schedule I under the Controlled Substances Act under federal law. That's the most restrictive category possible under federal law. And it basically means that possessing or using cannabis for any reason, unless you have express permission from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, is not just illegal, but criminal. So you can go to prison for it. And that's even just for possessing. You're standing there holding marijuana and you don't have DEA's a license from DEA to do that, then you're subject to criminal penalties. The reason that it's connected to research is because research requires you to possess marijuana. You can't research it if you can't hold it and handle it. And so to be able to handle marijuana, even if you're a scientist, and I'm using the word marijuana here, I know that's a kind of a bugaboo for many people. It's more politically correct and for good reason to use the word cannabis. I'm using the word marijuana because that's the word that is used in the federal statute. And just a slight diversion here, hemp is also cannabis, but hemp is not a controlled substance. And the difference between hemp and marijuana under federal law is the amount of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinols, one of the psychoactive components of marijuana. If there's enough delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinols, it becomes marijuana under federal law and it's Schedule I, go to jail for handling it. If it's lower than that amount of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinols, it's hemp and it's not a controlled substance. It's not under any schedule under the Controlled Substances Act. So back to what I was saying, if you're going to do research with marijuana, you have to handle it. And because you need DEA's permission to handle marijuana at all, you have to pay a lot of money and apply to DEA for a license to be able to research. And that's true whether you're a research university or you're a scientist. You don't need to be under any suspicion by DEA to have to get a license. Everyone has to get a license. And these licenses, you have to renew them every year, which means you have to go hat in hand to DEA and prove that you're still worthy to continue doing research. And here's the thing. The folks most qualified to do research, if you think about it, are the folks who know the most about marijuana, right? Which, are people operating under state law who have been working with marijuana for years and years and years and know the plant better than anybody. But because of DEA standards, those folks have been acting in violation of federal law because they handled the plant without a license before they came to DEA to get one, right? So if you've been in, say, at Humboldt University, right? And you know more than anybody in the world about marijuana, and you say, okay, well, I'd be the perfect person to go do this federal research that we need. And you go to DEA to get a license. DEA is going to say, well, you've been violating federal law by handling marijuana. So you are out of the running before you even start. The only people who have any chance of being able to do this and get one of these licenses are folks who have never violated federal law handling marijuana, which if you think about it, with all the folks, who are operating under state law, right, where states have legalized, all of that use and handling and possessing of marijuana is illegal under federal law. And so those folks are all out of the running before they even get started. And so you see how marijuana Schedule I classification narrows the window of people who could even apply for DEA's permission. It's expensive to get, it's hard to maintain, and so people, don't do it. It's very, very difficult. I mean, some do, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It actually gets harder from there because once you apply for a license, now you have to get marijuana from somewhere, right, to study it. And guess what? DEA doesn't just let you go down to the dispensary and buy some because that would violate federal law. So that means you're stuck. Either they say that you're stuck either with government weed, which is pretty much useless, and it's not like, you know, anything that you would find at a dispensary. So no one wants to study it, because if you're trying to study aspirin, why would you study Tylenol? You know what I mean?
It's not comparable.
Yeah. So then your other option is to go to one of 7 DEA licensed growers. And those folks can grow marijuana legally under federal law for research. But then it's a whole drawn out process. You have to wait for them to grow it. They have to get a quota for it. It's just this Kafka-esque nightmare of regulations and red tape, all to make it very, very difficult for you to study this stuff. And then meanwhile, they won't legalize it because they say that they don't have enough research.
So that's another thing too. Where does the FDA come into this?
So FDA, in order to get a research license from DEA, you have to go through not just DEA, but DEA will refer your application to FDA, and they will say, who is this person? Are they a bona fide researcher? And so if FDA doesn't think you're legitimate for whatever reason, then you're out of the running too. So you got to get past DEA, who's going to cut you out of the process automatically if you've ever handled marijuana in the past, right? And then you got to get through FDA, which is going to look at you have to submit a protocol, which is like, what are you going to do with this marijuana? You know, and just a little bit of background, folks who aren't familiar with FDA. FDA is the agency, it's within a bigger agency, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which, to give you an idea, the Department of Health and Human Services, you may have heard it called HHS. The secretary of HHS is Becerra in the Biden administration. The budget for HHS, the amount of your tax dollars that they get to run the programs that they run, is massive. It's bigger than most countries' like GDP, like in the world. It's huge. If it were a country, if HHS were a country, it would be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, just because of how much money it gets in your tax dollars, right? So then within HHS are many other agencies, you know, National Institute of Health, NIDA, you have a bunch. And one of them is FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. FDA's particular job is to like regulate the drug development and approval process. So what this really means is they basically like approve and regulate pharmaceutical drugs. So giant pharma companies, when they want to get their drugs to market, they have to go through FDA. And FDA does what's called pre-market approval of drugs. So before you can sell a drug on the market, you have to do all this research and prove to FDA that your drug is safe and effective to be used for whatever you're saying it's used for. That seems simple in theory, and it seems like a very good idea, and it is. We all rely on that. There's a very good reason we have those laws. However, because of this role and expertise that FDA has in drug development and approval, the federal government has also put them in charge of overseeing research of controlled substances like marijuana. And what this does is it kind of warps the path of all controlled substances to be either in the pharma lane, meaning regulated like a pharmaceutical drug, or they don't get approved at all, and you can't use them under federal law. Do you see what I'm saying? So there are pharmaceutical drugs that are derived from marijuana, like Epidiolex. There are synthetic forms of THC that pharmaceutical companies have come up with. Those are traditional pharma drugs, like, you know, a pill, a capsule, you know, something like that that you would get from the pharmacy. But what you don't expect to get from the pharmacy is bud, right? You don't, that is, you know, many people use it as medicine. And I want to be very clear that I'm just pointing out that it's not the usual case for a plant to be a pharmaceutical drug, yet we have a pharmaceutical agency overseeing the regulation of this plant. And that has created its own set of problems, because the ways and means that FDA uses to say whether something is safe and effective are all built for pills. You know, they're not built for plants. So just to give you one example, in order to get through the FDA process, a pill has to have repeatable chemistry. That means every pill, it's like Starbucks, right? Like every time you take an aspirin, It's got to be the same as the last aspirin and the next aspirin. But think about a plant like marijuana, right? Or cannabis. It is not the same from crop to crop, harvest to harvest, strain to strain. And so it's automatically disqualified from the traditional drug approval process. One other example, we don't usually, smoking in general is not a healthy thing to do. And I think everybody agrees about that. You know, people take different risks with their health, but all things being equal, swallowing a pill in general is safer than smoking, you know, inhaling and combusting something, right? So that's another reason that FDA, you know, prefers to have something in a capsule. And they're never going to look at something that you're smoking, like many people are using marijuana. They're never going to look at that and say, yeah, that's safe and effective, because they know that what they're used to seeing as safe and effective is a pill or a capsule or something like that. And so you just see that there's this big disconnect between the way that people have used and come to accept marijuana as a useful substance for them in their lives, and the way FDA regulates and sees the world. And that creates a whole other barrier, because when you go to do research, if you say, yeah, I want to let people self-titrate marijuana, meaning decide how much they need to feel better, right? And smoke it. FDA is like, we're not going to approve that protocol. That's not a scientific protocol according to FDA, because they're used to looking at pharmaceutical protocols.
So the question from the general public would be, from their perspective, there's been no one who's died from marijuana, but from the perspective of FDA approval on pills, we have an onslaught of hundreds of thousands of people who've died over the past 20 to 30 years from FDA approval drugs. Talk about opioids and these other synthetics that have been produced and distributed out to the population. How does the FDA react to that?
That's a really great question. And it's something very few people outside of the FDA world, you know, understand. And I don't blame them for that. It's frustrating because it affects our lives, and it's very difficult to get this information. So here it is. FDA does not approve or not approve a substance because it is or is not dangerous. Okay. So, and there is a background reason for that. Like, if you think about it, if you're on your deathbed and you have what appears to be a terminal illness, and you've tried everything out there, you'll be willing to take something very risky to treat your symptoms. Maybe, you know, you might be willing to take a very, very strong dose of fentanyl or morphine at the end of your life to help you deal with possible pain or symptoms, to be able to talk to your family one more time or something like that. You know what I mean? Whereas another person, that would seem absurd. And so what it boils down to is, it's not so simple as how dangerous is something. Instead, what FDA is looking at is the risk benefit of the substance for an indication. And what you have to understand is, in the world of the federal government, and this is huge, there are only two legitimate uses of a substance outside of like food. Okay, or, you know, a vitamin, like a dietary supplement or something like that. When you're talking about a drug, which is something that affects the chemical structure of the human body, that's how it's defined under federal law, which is like everything. The air you breathe would be a drug, right? Under this broad definition, because it affects your body's chemistry. Just stop breathing and you'll figure that out. So the FDA says the only two legitimate purposes for using a drug are scientific research that they approve, which I just went through how hard that is, right? And I actually didn't. I went through like the very beginning of that. It's actually much, much worse once you get into the economics, but suffice to say, it's very, very, very difficult to get through that channel. Second is medical purposes. And the only medical purposes that they see are ones that, they have approved. So if they have approved it, or your doctor, once something is approved, a doctor can give it to you for another reason. But outside of that, there's no legitimate use of a drug. So if you're using marijuana recreationally, right, even if you're using it at a doctor's recommendation, right, because FDA hasn't approved it as a drug under this pharmaceutical model, according to the federal government, right now at least, that is abuse. You're a drug abuser. And if your doctor recommended it and gave it to you, your doctor would be a drug pusher and violating federal law. Now, that's insane, right? But that is the world we've lived in, because there's been this disconnect between this pharmaceutical model and the state regulated markets of marijuana that have grown in different directions. So, you know, the reason that they'll approve fentanyl, even though it kills you, and they'll claim that that is legitimate, right? But they won't approve marijuana, even though it never killed somebody, is because to them, fentanyl at least has an accepted medical use for pain. And we all agree about that, right? I mean, nobody's going to say like a breakthrough cancer pain or you're getting knee surgery, you know, take it, right? Whereas with marijuana, because no pharmaceutical company has put it through that process, it doesn't have a legitimate medical use. And if you're using it, you're abusing it by definition under federal law. And this is the problem. It actually has nothing to do with how likely it is to kill you. In fact, let me just put this in concrete terms. You know, I've looked into this. There's something called an LD50 table, which is, it tells you how much of a substance you would have to consume to kill you. Okay. So I like Ben and Jerry's ice cream. You eat 20 pints of Ben and Jerry's, which I think I'm pretty sure I've gotten close, you know, in one sitting. And if you do, you'll die. The sucrose will kill you, the sugar. It'll be a great death if you can handle it, but you'll be dead, right? So how much marijuana do you think you'd have to consume to overdose?
I would think pounds of it. I don't think it's possible.
1,500 pounds in 15 minutes.
God, that's impossible. Although I know some guys that would try it, but
that's like it's like that movie Cool Hand Luke where he's eating the eggs. Do you remember? I don't know if you've seen that one. It's one of my favorite movies. Yeah. But anyway, that gives you an idea. So if you smoke too many cigarettes, you take too many aspirin, be your last headache. You know what I mean?
Right.
But marijuana, it's very difficult to, I mean, no one ever has, right? Because who's going to be able to eat? I mean, that's ridiculous. It's not a salad bar. So in any event, but the way that the federal government looks at it, it should have to do with danger, but they don't look at it that way.
So who should be regulating cannabis? How should this actually be set up? In a perfect world. I
mean, in my view, and this is a very deep policy question, and I think reasonable people can disagree, you know, but I've looked at it a lot, and throwing my cards on the table so people know where I'm coming from, I tend to be a libertarian in general. And so take this for what it's worth. But my view is that, you know, my libertarian biases aside, we've seen that this just doesn't work with the federal government trying to force the square peg into the round hole here to treat this medicine that there's like real life where we know people are benefiting from it, and doctors are recommending it. People are using it in treatment across the country in droves. And for the federal government to bury its head in the sand and say that doesn't have a legitimate medical use is silly. And it's also silly to say that anybody using marijuana for any other reason is a drug abuser. It's ridiculous. And in fact, the federal government doesn't put its money where its mouth is in that regard. You don't see them out there arresting people in droves for using marijuana. In fact, you know, there's very little enforcement. And this undermines the rule of law, right? When the government says something's the law and pounds the drum, but then doesn't follow through, it's like me when I tell my 4-year-old that she better not do something, and then I never actually give the consequence. She's going to learn that I'm full of shit and that she can do what she wants. And that over time erodes the rule of law, right? And, you know, not to get too deep into it, but this is all against a backdrop where we know how these laws came about from a racist background, from a power grab that was illegitimate to begin with, that was never about science to begin with. If you don't know that, go look up the Schaefer Commission report sometime and read about it. So the point is, this is all very deleterious to the rule of law and basic principles that we all kind of agree on as Americans. And so the way it ought to be done is we ought to acknowledge that. And we ought to, and look, President Biden, to his great credit, came out and said that this is, you know, he called this whole thing our failed approach to marijuana in his October 6th proclamation, and called for the executive branch to reconsider all of this. And I'm in the process of working on that. And he said no one should be in jail for for marijuana possession or use. And if he means that, which we should all assume he didn't say it lightly, then cannabis can't be a Schedule I substance, because as long as it can't be controlled substance at all. Even if it were in Schedule V, the least restrictive controlled substance schedule, people could still go to prison for possessing and using it. So the only way to accomplish the president's goal, and this is what we should do, is to deschedule it, accept the fact that the states are regulating, and some are doing better than others. But imagine if we had the investment that we normally have from the federal government. We have tied our best research universities' hands behind their back and prevented people from researching this stuff for 50 years, right? More than that, longer than that. And the reason is because universities, many of them, most get federal funding. And that is called conditional spending. And what it means is the federal government says, universities, we're going to hand out loads of taxpayer dollars, lots of it, so much that if you want to compete as a university for the best students, the best faculty, be the best university in the country, you're going to need this money. If you don't get this money, your competitor down the street is going to get it, right? So imagine, I went to the University of Texas. Imagine, and we have a problem with the University of Oklahoma, right? That's just a thing. So Texas is looking, if we don't take this federal funding, Oklahoma is going to have that federal funding and we're not going to be able to compete. So all these universities want to accept it. But in exchange for that federal money, they have to agree to all these absurd controlled substances laws, which means all of their great scientists, all of the great researchers and labs in the country, the best ones we have, can't handle marijuana without getting one of these Schedule I licenses. And frankly, it's too much work and they're too afraid of risking their federal money to do it. And so they've all been working with their hands tied behind their back on this for years. We ought to stop that. We ought to deschedule it, let these universities study it, put out better, national standards, work with the states to figure out what works and what doesn't, stop putting people in jail, pardon them. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, I know that you're a veteran, and I know a lot of veterans. And did you know that just having a medical marijuana card makes it so that you are not allowed under federal law to possess a firearm?
Hey, Shane, thanks a lot for coming on and talking to us about the complexities of marijuana research. Join us next time. We're going to talk to Dr. Curry Myers. He's a former sheriff and a professor in criminology. I'm going to ask him the question, if legalization happened, what happens with first responders? How does it affect them? Join us next week. Hey everybody, this is Robert Head with Hemp for Victory. Subscribe to our channel where we talk about the things that cannabis is doing in the veteran community, all these positive things that we see around us. So subscribe. Love to see you.